so I think we're okay. Thank you so much for attending this event this morning. We're really excited, as Jen said, to kick off this program, and hopefully you will find resources and things that will help you during the course of today. But also, I think more importantly, to understand that there's going to be developed over the coming months a series of tools and resources that you will be able to use, and so to keep coming back and checking in with us. But very pleased to have you here, and really looking forward as well to any questions that you might want to ask as we go through. So education support has been around since 1877. We exist to improve the mental health and well-being of everybody working in education. So we're the only charity in the UK that has that really explicit remit around education staff. And that's in primary, secondary and tertiary, and for anyone in any role in education at that. The reason that we focus on that work is very simply because we believe that better well-being leads to better education. I don't think that's terribly contentious. And in Wales, with the work that you've been doing, obviously well-being is now becoming an increasingly critical pillar of education. And in that sense is leading the way for much of the rest of the UK. But I guess to start off this conversation, I wanted to come and talk to you about some of the context around teacher well-being, and then to just have some ideas about some of the things that we can do to improve teacher well-being. In terms of talking about that context and background, our charity has for the last 3 years undertaken an annual research exercise. We produce something called the Teacher Wellbeing Index. This is, if you're interested in this, all this information is on our website, and I'll be giving you a link to it in the slides at the end. But without getting into loads of the detail about it, I think it's really important to just establish a little bit about what we do know about teacher well-being. And I'm using the word teacher. The index covers all roles. So this is also really important for support staff, for school business managers, for anyone really who's involved in terms of any role in the school. What we saw long before COVID was, if you watch here, the red is the extent, the proportion of either teachers, we'll have some other roles in a moment, or leaders who are stressed. And in 2017, those reds were at 67% for teachers, rising to 73% in 2019. And in 2017, 75% for leaders, rising to 84%. We've seen a relatively stable turnout here for other roles. We will next month publish the 2020 index, which is going to give us another data set to compare with. But what you can see really clearly, without being a mathematician, is that the context for people working in education is one of significant stress. And that is, I think, the backdrop to everything that's happened with COVID. And so we can pay a lot of attention. There's a lot of conversation at the moment about what's happening in terms of schools dealing with COVID and dealing with stress. But it's really important for us to understand that this is against a backdrop of quite a high degree of stress coming into this. What's driving the stress for people working in our schools and colleges? Well, work-life balance and excessive workload are really quite key here. And that's the language that gets cited. But actually, when we look further down this list, unreasonable demands from managers, lack of trust, rapid pace, there's also a bunch of things here that also imply additional workload. So workload itself and work-life balance is really important for people working in the sector. Student and pupil behaviour, of course, is as well. And when we speak to educators, increasingly parent behaviour is becoming something to take into account in that mix. But work-life balance, a really critical one. I suppose one of the, I'm not going to go through loads of statistics despite starting with a couple of these slides, but this is a bit of a busy slide. But the key thing I want you to take away here is that over 3/4 of our education workforce in 2019 experienced either a behavioural, physical, or psychological mental health symptom that was related to their work. That's significantly higher than the general workforce. So again, making that point that in the education sector, we are seeing disproportionate amounts of stress and symptoms related to mental ill health in the working population. We measure something called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale on an annual basis, and we try and understand how that's moving from one year to the next. So that particular score is one of the ways that we can track whether things are improving a little or actually getting a little bit worse. What we found in 2019 was that this score of 44.7 was the overall UK education workforce. In Wales, the picture was a little bit more positive. So Welsh educators were a little bit better, feeling better in themselves. Their mental well-being was better and stronger than the wider UK picture. And whilst that is really important and good news, Wales as a region was higher than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. It also comes against the fact that the Welsh population actually is also a little bit higher than the overall UK population. And there is a gap between educators and the general population. So for all that this is a really positive picture to see in terms of how educators in Wales are feeling, there is still a gap with the general population. So there is still work for us to do to look to narrow that gap and make sure that for those working in education, there isn't any additional cost to their well-being. So that's where we were before COVID. The impact of COVID has been really, it's been obviously very difficult and very painful, but very uneven for people. So there has been not one shared experience across education. I'm putting this reference in because we can share the slides with you and you'll be able to find the additional research on our website and through any of these routes if you want to find it. But the key things to tell you that were in that report: the mental health of the workforce did come under pressure. More than half of our educators have had a difficult time and felt that their mental health was negatively impacted by what happened during lockdown and dealing with the pandemic. There's a really positive message in here about appreciation. So educators have felt really well appreciated by their colleagues and well appreciated by their senior leaders in schools and colleges. And that really matters because we know that for people working in schools and colleges, collegiality is a really important part of building what we call protective resilience. And protective resilience is what enables you to, it sort of puts down a positive foundation to let you draw on when things get more difficult. So things that build our protective resilience basically make us stronger, and we'll be able to draw on that reservoir at some point in the future. Collegiality is particularly for people working in education important. It's one of the things that is most important to their own sense of well-being. So feeling appreciated by colleagues and leaders is actually a really positive thing. There was some less positive feedback in that as well. People felt not terribly well appreciated by government and really not at all appreciated by national media. So there's some learning for us in that space, and appreciation matters. Any one of us could say, I didn't feel appreciated. Nobody was appreciating me during the pandemic. But actually, we don't mean it in that way. When we talk about appreciation in this context, it's leading very directly to satisfaction and to sense of purpose, and has a really direct impact on well-being and mental health. So it is really, really important that we pay attention to these findings around appreciation. Unsurprisingly, educators wanted more and better testing for COVID. The challenges that people talked about being particularly acute at this time were work completion, wanting in secondary schools, how to make sure that young people were doing what they were asked to do was really problematic for educators. Dealing with government guidance, this was considerably worse in England than in Wales, but the timeliness of guidance was an issue for some people in schools, and then workload for leaders was, unsurprisingly to any of us who've been around schools at this time, really an acute issue and one that continues to be problematic. In terms of transitioning back in September, educators were worried about second spike. They wanted to get good and appropriate health and safety guidance, and they wanted to know what was going to happen with exams. So these are, the whole assessment process is obviously a very big issue for people in the sector. And then support. People wanted good, timely support with health and safety, with learning priorities and assessment, again, coming through as a big message, supporting pupil mental health, and also CPD that was timely and relevant to the particular issues that people were facing at the moment. So, for example, around technology. This is what the frontline is reporting back as being the key issues since COVID started. There was one particular finding from that research around COVID that we found very interesting, and it was this. And again, once you say this out loud, it seems blindingly obvious, but these things don't exist in the literature, so it's important for us to have the data to be able to make the case to policymakers about how we change the support that we provide to the education workforce. We found that people who described themselves as having high resilience had a smaller impact on their own mental health than people who described themselves as having lower resilience. Those people had a much greater impact on their mental health. Their mental health declined by more than those who had high resilience. And whilst that seems like a truism, actually finding that in the evidence base is really important. And what it tells us is this: we can put these things together from the different pieces of research that we've done. We know that as demand on the education workforce increases, their resilience goes down. It's driven down. And that happens to anybody who's working in a high demand environment. It erodes our resilience over time. When our resilience goes down, our mental health decreases. And so this is the link that we want to focus on and we want to disrupt to a large extent. And some of the messages that we will be communicating both later in this presentation, but actually throughout this project of work in Wales, is that we need to intervene at different places. We will be talking to policymakers in our advocacy role about the demand on educators. And there are many stakeholders across Wales who are making exactly that point. We will be talking to individual teachers and support staff and indeed school leaders about resilience, because it's one of the few things that you yourself can pay some attention to for your own benefit. We are very clear that we don't promote resilience, and we don't try and help people to build their resilience so that they can do more and shoulder more burden. That's not the perspective that we're coming at it from. In our view, if you are working in education at a time like this, when COVID is in the background, then your resilience is coming under significant pressure. Anything that we can do to support you to build that and ultimately to stay well is for you, the educator. Our charity was founded by teachers for teachers. We exist to support the profession for the individuals in it. And so I think it's a really important point to make, that we're not here in order to support you to do yet more work. That's not the point of this, and that's not what any of this conference today or subsequent support is about. But this is the place where you can make some difference yourself to how you are, whilst we lobby to change the extent of demand or create better support around you. So to that point, what can we do? Well, this graphic was produced by colleagues, and I don't expect you to be able to read it. Again, we can circulate the slides. But what all of these pictures are telling us in one form or another is that people are not confident to discuss significant stress or mental health issues with their employers. And they don't feel like there's great guidance in their workplaces. They wouldn't take their conversations to colleagues at work particularly. They take them to family or friends if they're taking them anywhere at all. And they don't think there's necessarily the right degree of support inside their schools and colleges. So this is an area for us to work, because one of the things that we can immediately start to see is we've got more work to do around mental health awareness, around taking the stigma away and making it okay for people to discuss how they're feeling. And that's something that the narrative has changed around a lot over the last 5 years. 5 years ago, it was far less common for people to talk openly about things that might make them feel less well, that might affect their mental well-being or their emotional health. And now that's slowly beginning to become much more of the conversation. And of course, that's partly because we want to do that for the children and young people we support. And I think there's a lot of recognition that we can't support children and young people well if we are not also ourselves in a good place. So when we talk about how can we begin to address the background I've painted of ongoing stress and then a ratcheting up of demand that comes through the COVID situation, well, we would contend that we need to address it at 3 different levels, because if we try and just fix it with one particular approach, we don't think that's sufficient. And the 3 levels that we think are important are the individual, the workplace, and the overall education system. And so it is our view that if we begin to support both how the system operates, how schools and colleges as workplaces can well support the people who are there, the adults who are there in the schools and colleges, and as individuals, how all of us can be better supported and the choices that we make be better ones for us. We think that together, these three things can allow us to take some of that stress out of the education workplace and actually allow us to focus on much of what's so joyful about working with children and young people in a school setting. To say a little bit more about that, and I won't dwell too long on the system and the workplace piece, in terms of what we see happening in the system, well, accountability pressure is something that we are aware drives pressure through schools onto teachers and support staff and other staff within schools. So this plays out in different ways. Obviously, we've got Eston paused at the moment, so there's, that's a pressure that's been relieved in this particular window. But the way in which our accountability system works, and there's very positive moves to look to make this less punitive and less about judging professionals and far more about building capacity in the sector. That's a really positive shift. And if we can get to a place where the accountability system is building the confidence of the people working in schools and is allowing people to develop in a really positive way without the negative connotations that come with high stakes inspections, then we believe that's a really positive contribution to improving the mental health and well-being of people working in our schools and colleges. Professional identity and trust is really important. We had last week or the week before Andreas Schleicher, who heads up education at the OECD, talking about the UK education system. And actually, when he talks about it, he makes far less distinction than we do about the differences between England, Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. And so he sees a lot of commonality across the UK. And one of these areas that he speaks to is the industrial nature of teaching across the United Kingdom. Now, that's a whole other conversation in and of itself, but there is something in that speaks to this issue of professional identity and trust. One of the things that we know we need to improve in our education system is the extent to which educators and support staff have influence, they have voice, and they're able to contribute to decision making at the policy level. And again, in Wales, we see actually a lot of very positive practice in this space, but some of the feedback that we hear is that it's always the same people who get to be around the table and contribute and represent the profession. So there is something for us to do to reach out and bring new voices and a wider range of individuals around the table to contribute. And again, the more that we can do to build the professional identity, to build on the way in which the professional identity of our educators is shaping the education system, then we think that that will allow educators to feel better reflected, more trusted, more respected. And that in itself creates a virtuous circle for people's well-being and mental health, because they feel like they're able to make a difference. Then they feel like their contribution is valued. Workload remains a key issue. And so we continue to need to look at what is happening in the education system that is contributing to workload and make sure that we can take some corrective action to that where we need to. There are a bunch more things that we talk about in this space, but I don't want to use this session to focus on them. What I would say is if you registered for this event, then you'll have Jennifer Hart's email address. Send us your insight. We would love to hear what it is that you think is really important right now in the education system in Wales that is affecting mental health and well-being for the workforce. So please talk to us and share that insight, and we can use that to then shape not only the support that we offer, but feedback that we can make to Welsh Government about where we might be able to make changes and developments in the sector. So going back to that triangle, we talked about the system. Now thinking about the education workplace, what needs to happen to improve well-being for our workforce? Well, we need to have some really clear strategies around what do we mean by well-being and mental health of staff? What do we want to do to really create that kind of culture in our schools and colleges individually? And how might we measure success? Culture and leadership is really, really important. In all the literature we look at this, we look at mental health and well-being of the education workforce in, the culture and leadership of the school that somebody works in really, really matters. It's a variable, because you can have schools in the same system that are where people feel really well valued and their contribution is acknowledged and they feel like they can make a difference. But we also have schools in that same system where people feel it's a very top-down hierarchical approach. You know, speak when you're spoken to, don't go thinking and offering thoughts outside your area. And that kind of culture works obviously a lot less well for how people feel, and has a negative impact on the well-being of people who work in that second kind of culture. So culture really, really matters. And culture is, of course, quite amorphous. It's hard to get your arms around, but we're talking about the values, the behaviors, the beliefs, the social norms that exist in a place of work. And that is something that is really readily, can be addressed. Leaders can step back, and good leaders can see themselves as capable of shaping a culture that is going to support and sustain the well-being and mental health of people working in a particular school. If you're going to pay attention to well-being and mental health, it's really wise to have some kind of baseline staff survey so you can track over time and see if the changes that are being made are helpful. You might want to consider stress risk assessments if you haven't already. The Health and Safety Executive provides some support around this, and indeed education support. We're also looking at what we can do to support you in Wales around this. Having the right policies and practices in the school that speak to mental health and well-being, but actually more broadly, that the policies and practices of the school are consistent and coherent, so that you don't have, for example, a behaviour policy that is demanding in a way that we know would create poor well-being for the staff team that have to execute it. So it is about the policies that relate directly to mental health and well-being, but actually it's across all the policies that operate in a school environment, and making sure that they are all facing in the same direction, and you don't have opposition created by a policy on this conflicting with a requirement for that. So that coherence can be harder to achieve than it sounds, but it takes a little bit of time to go through and map out what the different policies are pointing to and try and make sure they're headed in the same direction. Making sure that the staff team has access to counselling, we would argue, is really important. And it's important, everybody knows that if you're under significant stress or you're in crisis, well, it's a great time to reach out for help. But actually, increasingly, what we need to do in our own individual workplaces is create a culture where we encourage people to have a conversation, not because they're at crisis point, but perhaps because they don't feel great. They feel a bit flat. They feel a bit confused. Or, during the period of lockdown for people, particularly secondary school teachers who were at home, they're feeling isolated. It's really important that we encourage staff to pick up the phone and have a conversation with somebody if they're feeling less than brilliant, and they don't need to have a particularly dramatic crisis point to encourage them to do that. Too many of us feel that we ought to keep a stiff upper lip and, well, I'm not that bad that I need to reach out and ask for help, and I don't want to take that away from somebody else who might need it more than me. Actually, we need to transform the whole culture so that it is really commonplace and reflexive for us to ask, to speak to others, to reach out, to have conversations, and to put words on the feelings and experiences that we're having. Beginning to articulate how we feel, beginning to articulate where our own mental health and well-being is a really important part of creating the right culture for us to support that across the workplace. And then there's a sort of baseline of school-wide skill and knowledge that we think is really helpful if you want to support staff well-being. And that's about having consistent mental health awareness, talking about resilience and personal well-being, and giving people specific tools to develop that for themselves, having good, solid protocols around communication and feedback in the school, and having training for anyone with line management responsibility so that they know how to support and respond to the mental health of their own staff teams. Then we come to the individual piece. So one of the things that has the single most important, the single biggest impact on people in the workplace in terms of their well-being and mental health is their line management relationship. When our line management relationships are positive, that gives us an extra layer of ballast. It makes the actual sort of day-to-day work experience far more positive. If our line management experience is not positive, then that flips around the other side, and actually it can become all-consuming, and it can be very difficult for us to see beyond that because it clouds the experience that we're having. So paying attention to not the structures of line management and not even the processes of line management, but the relationships between line managers and staff is really, really important as a barometer for our mental health and well-being. And we need to make sure that individuals have the opportunity to feed back on that and to share how that experience is for them. However you do it, whether it's through a staff survey or in some environments, people skip a layer and allow for sort of 360-degree feedback. But that's a really important point for us. And as individuals ourselves, when we are asked about how we are, it's really important we offer feedback, not criticism and not judgment, but feedback on specific things that are more and less helpful. Because by offering that feedback, we enable the people who we're working with to do a better job supporting us. The next thing that I think is really important for individuals is around workload. And I'm not talking about volume here, actually. This is about the type of work. We know from our work with educators over the years that they'll work long hours. I'm not saying that they should. My slides earlier said they shouldn't. So I'm not at all advocating that high volume workload is a good thing. But actually what really matters for the well-being and mental health of people working in education is the type of work they're engaged in. And if that work is facing the students and the pupils, if they're able to get their sleeves rolled up and engage with whole child, whole person, and align their teaching with their own values, then the volume of hours matters a lot less to people. But if the type of work they're asked to do becomes quite bureaucratic or removed from their core purpose, that's really damaging to well-being and mental health. So there's something about making sure that we can allow people to have some control over where they spend their time and allow them to do the stuff insofar as is possible. Obviously, we can't take people out of class and so on, but insofar as is possible, allow people to engage in the type of work that they find fulfilling. Autonomy is a huge part of individual well-being. So in schools, historically, we've had a very hierarchical controls. It's probably not a surprise that the term old school refers to schools, because there is that kind of hierarchical, quite structured, quite rigid organizational style, if you like, that we have in many schools. And that still persists, though when the culture changes, it feels a lot less hierarchical. But what we know from the research across work and stress is that where an individual is in a situation where there's a high degree of demand placed on them, but they have a very low level of control, that becomes profoundly unsatisfying and doesn't leave somebody thriving, doesn't leave them feeling well and happy in their work. Actually, it has quite a negative impact on them. So insofar as we can, as individuals, we want to be in conversation with our line managers, in conversation with the people around us, our department heads, whoever it is, about how we might be able to increase a little bit the control that we have over our working lives, and if there's anything we can do to dampen down the demand. Now, again, Wales comes out better here than other parts of the United Kingdom, and so there's a positive trajectory, and I recognise that there's a big degree of demand that's needed to embed the new curriculum and to make the changes that are currently in train. But there is a positive shift here that will ultimately leave the workforce in a better position around demand and control. But it's something that we need to think about both from a school management perspective, but actually as individuals. How can I better shape? What conversations can I have to better shape how my work allows me to feel more and less satisfied in what I'm doing? And then I think this point around emotional content of role is increasingly important. Educators become a default front line of mental health support for children and young people. And that's a sort of shift in our society over time that has left us in this particular place. We need to be very careful with our education workforce that we don't have unreasonable expectations. You know, educators, teachers, support staff, they are not social workers and they're not psychotherapists. And we need to be really clear that with all of our staff, that that's not an expectation. That said, educators will, you know, often be in a situation where they are supporting a child or a young person with something very difficult, or they have a particular role, a safeguarding role or a SENCO role that leaves them exposed to a lot of emotional content. When that is the case, we need to pay attention to our educators and make sure that they're not at risk of burnout, that they're not going to be overwhelmed and exhausted by a relentlessness of high emotional content in their day-to-day work. There is, for some, the risk of secondary trauma. Again, we have videos and explanations of this stuff on our website. Secondary trauma is where, when you're supporting, in this case, children or young people who've experienced their own trauma. So let's imagine we're living in a part of the country that's had a very high incidence of COVID-related death, for example, where many families have been touched. Then you might come in contact with many young people who've experienced some kind of trauma. It's clearly not solely related to COVID at all, but where that repeated pattern of being the person who's supporting someone else with their trauma happens, that can have a really negative impact on yourself and actually leave you with feelings of having been traumatized yourself. That happens in very few circumstances. That's not the general experience of people out in schools, but I suppose the indicators of concern en route to becoming a bit burnt out or a bit overwhelmed by the emotional content of the role are things that we've seen in the research that we've done. And so we would argue that if you're in a role where you have a very high degree of content, of emotional content, talk to your line manager, talk to the school leaders about how they can support you to handle that. The situation we don't want is where somebody is carrying that and doesn't have the opportunity to reflect on it and doesn't have the opportunity to talk about it in a safe space, ideally with somebody independent. Because that will, it doesn't go away. Somebody will carry it with them one way or another and it will affect them. So we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing by people who are in roles where they are experiencing a lot of emotional content through their day-to-day job and allow them to understand how it's affecting them. And then I think there's also a piece around personal choices here. And this is, I need to be really clear, this isn't about judging people to say, well, if you'd made some better personal choices, you wouldn't be experiencing this stress level or your mental health wouldn't be affected. That's not really what I'm trying to get at. It's much more for each of us to reflect ourselves on what our choices are and how we can make better choices. When we went into lockdown, I found I had a really difficult first week. I was really knocked for 6. And I had to do some thinking. There are aspects of self-care that I excel at. If I need to celebrate a good achievement, I am excellent at reaching for a bottle of good wine and cooking a really nice meal. I really do that terribly well. I'm very diligent at that type of self-care. But when it comes to taking aerobic exercise, I'm considerably less diligent. And that's a really difficult choice for me to make. So at the beginning of lockdown, I had to sit with this and think, well, I know, because I work in this field, I know that getting exercise is going to help me get through this whole lockdown piece. So I need to make better choices about how I do that and be as good at choosing exercise as I am at choosing the bottle of wine to celebrate, So it's not for us to judge other people. It's for us to honestly reflect on ourselves and think about what different choices we could make, what better choices we could make. Self-care is something I think we're going to talk about in the subsequent sessions today, but I want to just make a couple of points here. One is self-care is not the same as self-indulgence. It is not selfish to look after yourself, particularly as people working in education. By caring for yourself, you're investing in your own ability to stay strong over this coming academic year. So it's the opposite of self-indulgence. Actually, it's the hallmark of being a good professional. We know from what we see in the academic literature, there is a lot of evidence that people with higher levels of self-compassion and kindness to themselves have a lower incidence of mental health issues or symptoms from anxiety, stress, and depression. So it is really important that you find some time in your day. It doesn't have to be a big amount of time, but some time in your day to do something for yourself that is restorative. And I think it's really important to understand that the opposite of working is not working. You can be not working and your head can be full of it and you can be distracted and not able to be present to the people around you. That's not the same. That's, you know, to all intents and purposes, part of you is still working. The opposite of working is to let yourself be fully absorbed in something else that wholly occupies you, and your brain and your heart and all, the whole of yourself is absorbed in something very different. That's the opposite of work. And that's what we need to get to when we step away from the treadmill, if you like, of work and what we're doing. I just want to draw your attention to some signs to watch out for, either in yourself or in colleagues. These are symptoms or issues that might pop up for anybody, and they don't always relate to a well-being issue or to a mental health issue. But if you start to get clusters of these symptoms routinely, then it's important to pay attention to what's going on for people. And if you're seeing it in colleagues, to have, you know, to reach out and have a conversation with them about how they are. Or if you don't have that confidence, to talk to a colleague or somebody in the leadership team who would do that. Mental health hygiene, these are the things that everybody tells you you should do. And I don't want to tell grannies to suck eggs or anything like it, but the fact is, these things do make a massive difference and are well evidenced in the literature. Getting exercise, eating well, moderating your sugar and alcohol intake, having good sleep habits, moderating your social media consumption, practicing gratitude, finding ways to be creative, talking about your feelings, accepting uncertainty, very difficult for many of us in this context, and also realizing that a wide range of responses is actually perfectly normal. And you don't need to judge anyone else or yourself for having those responses. Education support, then, just to wrap up and tell you about the charity, we offer free support and advice for individuals. We have wellbeing services for schools, and we do a lot of research and advocacy work, as I said to you at the start. This helpline number, this 08000 number, is available to all of you 24/7 every day of the year. It's staffed by accredited counsellors. They don't come on the phone and start theraping you, but you can call them up and they know how to have a conversation. They know how to speak to people and how to support people. It's independent, confidential and free. Nobody knows that you've rung. You're wholly able to use that service confidently, knowing that it is confidential. Through our website, you can access information to grants. For people working in schools who are in financial distress, we are sometimes able to make a small grant to help people stay in their work or stay in their home, and where we can do that, we will. You can find out that information and more on our website, including a bunch of video resources on bereavement or secondary trauma or anxiety, so on and so forth. There's some contact details for me personally, but as I said, you've also got my colleague Jen's email from your registration. But do get in touch and let us know what is important to you, what support you need, what you think is required in the sector, and we will do whatever we can to make that support available. Jen.
Very much indeed, Sinead. Really interesting. We have a couple of minutes, so if there is a question, please type it into the chat function. If you go to the bottom toolbar, you should be able to access the chat function there. Do we have any questions for Sinead? One that's come to me actually, Sinead, I mean, obviously it's quite a difficult picture that we're describing here. What do you think are the positives that might come out of this whole episode?
Well, I think one of the main positives is that is connection. You know, I think people feel the importance of relationships. I think we've seen that in how educators have described feeling appreciated by their school leaders and by their colleagues. But actually, so many of us are missing key relationships in our lives. We realize there isn't really a substitute for that. You know, we can talk to our loved ones by Zoom, but it's not the same as being with them. So I think an appreciation for relationships is really important. I think people are learning to talk a little bit more easily about mental health and about feelings. And it's more in the culture of how we describe the impact of something like a pandemic, which I think has the important feature of taking away some of the stigma about mental health more broadly, because we're all learning that actually it's good to talk and it's okay to not feel okay. That's becoming very much in the mainstream of culture. So I think that's really important. And I think in education, you know, one of the things that we know in any situation of stress, like this kind of whole COVID situation, is that a sense of purpose is an important element of supporting anyone to live a good life. And of course, what we see in schools up and down the country are professionals who have a really clear sense of purpose. They absolutely know why they're there and what they're there to do. And so I think there's leadership that we can see in the education sector that slowly other parts of society are paying attention to and becoming interested in. So I think there's also an opportunity for us to remind the rest of the world how important our schools and our education workforce really are.
Absolutely, thank you for that. All that remains for me to say on behalf of Education Support is thank you very much indeed for attending this. Sorry, Sinead.
Jane, just one quick question from Jane there. How do you deal with head teachers not engaging in dialogue? Just to say, I think this is where looking at the other stakeholders in the school, however, you know, if you've got school governors or whoever is involved with supporting the head teacher, it's finding the way to have a conversation with them or to raise it, which isn't easy and will require some thought, but it might be something we can take a conversation offline about if there's a particular issue with trying to flag that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So yeah, I really hope that we see, also we've got one more question, which is what advice could you give to schools who still fear that they are judged by ESTEN inspection reports?
I think this is, again, speaks to the significant actor here is the school leader, because school leaders are either acting as an umbrella and protecting the wider staff team from external pressures that fall down on the school, or the leader themselves is feeling that pressure and then tends to share it on more broadly across the school team. I think that the nature of inspection and the nature of accountability is changing, and is changing in Wales probably at a faster pace than elsewhere. I think finding all of the opportunities to continue to contribute to that dialogue, whether it's through your unions, whether it's through a program like this, are really, really important. But the most important thing is the leader, and probably what we need to try and do is get support to those leaders so they have confidence in thinking, you know, we're focused on running our school in the way that we think is best for our community, and we're not going to be taken off course by that due to some external pressure. We are going to do the thing that we're trying to do in the best way possible. So it is a bit that interaction between individual, workplace and the system. We can try and advocate for change in the policy side, and we also need to get some more support to head teachers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we are going to have to wrap up. I do hope to see as many of you as possible in further sessions today. We've got a really good lineup. Next up is Mike Armiger, and we're going to jump out of this room and magically jump into his room and look forward to his session. So thank you very much, Sinead. Thank you very much for everyone. And I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks a million, everyone.